There's an interesting debate going on in Canada about how much governments should subsidize the decarbonization of oil and gas production. Now, on the one hand, it could be argued that oil and gas shouldn't be subsidized at all. A, it makes lots of money, and B, peak oil demand is coming in 2030, according to the International Energy Agency. On the other hand, oil and gas are Canada's biggest exports, about $100 to $120 billion a year. That's twice what the automotive sector is. That's number two. So governments, as you can imagine, get a lot of revenue, tax revenue and royalty revenue from oil and gas. And so they're motivated to keep that revenue stream going. So I'm going to talk to Vanessa Corkal, who is a senior policy advisor for the International Institute of Sustainable Development's Energy program, working on the Canadian Energy Transitions team. And she is one of the authors of The Bottom Line: Why Government Support for Decarbonizing Oil and Gas is a Bad Investment. So welcome to the interview, Vanessa.
Thanks. Great to be here as always, Markham.
Now, did I frame that correctly? You know, it's governments are being asked to subsidize things like carbon capture, utilization, and storage. They're being asked to provide discounts for carbon pricing. This is Alberta. So governments, but also governments get a lot of revenue, so they don't want to kill the golden goose. Is that a good way to frame this this debate, this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of moving pieces when we talk about how to get our emissions from oil and gas down. And I think part of it is certainly the revenues conversation, the reality that the sector is a significant part of Canadian exports. But I think, of course, there's all sorts of other dynamics at play, including provincial, federal dynamics, and the current political tensions between provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan and the federal government, as well as perhaps a lack of clarity from the federal government about what the intentions are for that sector in the long term and its compatibility with our ultimate net zero targets.
Yeah, I would, and I should point out for viewers who aren't familiar with this, but Energy Media has been arguing for a long time that the oil and gas, if it has a future, it has to be in providing feedstock for materials manufacturing, advanced materials like carbon fiber, and transition away from being feedstock for fuels like gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. And that conversation is only just getting onto the table. So how do we further this conversation? Given the political tensions between the producing provinces and the federal government, which is trying to, put on an oil and gas emissions cap, and is being asked, the federal government's being asked to put a lot of money into some of these decarbonization efforts. How do we further the conversation? Where does that conversation have to take place? Behind closed doors between politicians, out in the public with members, just ordinary Canadians? How should we advance that?
Well, I think there's two kind of main contextual pieces to keep in mind. The first contextual piece is the environmental piece, which is Canada has its targets for reducing emissions by 40 to 45% by 2030 and net zero by 2050, our commitments under the Paris Agreement. But in addition to those emissions reduction commitments, we also have broader commitments to eliminate inefficient fossil fuel subsidies by 2023, which is coming just around the corner, and broader goals to eliminate public finance for fossil fuels, both domestic and international. So when we talk about providing support to the oil and gas sector for decarbonization, we really need to look at it through the lens of whether that aligns with government commitments that it's made, not only domestically, but in international fora like the G20 on subsidies and public finance. The second piece is more of the economic context, which is how is Canada planning its industrial context for 2030 and 2050? And like you said, the role of the oil and gas sector in that pathway. And, certainly that needs to align with a 1.5 degree pathway, but we also need to be thinking about the long-term economic stability of that sector and what sectors we may need to put more emphasis on in order to make sure that we have a strong economic future and jobs for all those that are currently employed in the oil and gas sector. So those are kind of the two pieces. We have the economic and the environmental. If we look at the commitments that Canada has on subsidies and support, there's a strong argument to be made that supporting decarbonization of oil and gas is not efficient. There's a number of reasons for this. The first reason is that decarbonizing production has very limited impact towards mitigating climate change in the long term. It accounts for the emissions from production itself, but it does not account for the life cycle emissions that come from burning that oil and gas. And when we look at the oil and gas sector compared to other sectors in Canada, the oil and gas sector is responsible for over a quarter of Canada's emissions and has done very little in succeeding to reduce those overall emissions since 2005. We've seen other sectors like the electricity sector reduce its emissions by 52% over the same period. Emissions from heavy industry have dropped by 18%, and the oil and gas sector emissions have been increasing. So I think when we're looking at things from an efficiency perspective, we really need to look at, have we had success with existing subsidies to decarbonize? And there's a strong argument to say that they have not been efficient at all.
I want to bring up the ability of the industry to pay for its own decarbonization, because it used to, and it's often, the industry still argues that, okay, we're making enormous profits today, but markets are very cyclical. So in the past, we've had 2, 3, 4 years of really good years. Then they go, 1 or 2 or 3 years of really bad years where they're losing money. And when it averages out to be, a profitable sector, but not as profitable as others, like tech, for instance. But there seems to be a substantive structural change going on here. Since 2015, 2016, the industry has really underinvested in exploration and production, which leads to less production and a tighter supply, which keeps prices up. Now it looks like the Saudi Arabia is back in control, and OPEC is back in control as the swing producer, which has been their role since the 70s. And their intent looks to be, like, certainly through the 2020s, to prop up prices in the $80 to $100 a barrel range, which makes Canadian production incredibly profitable. So I would argue, the industry doesn't accept this, but I would argue that the 2020s at the very least are going to be very profitable for oil and gas. And if there was ever a time for the industry to fund its own decarbonization without government subsidy, now is that time.
Yeah, that's a very strong argument. I think, the cyclical nature of profits, like this boom and bust cycle, is actually, in my view, an additional argument as to why we need to move beyond oil and gas from an energy security perspective and economic stability perspective anyways. In the current context, oil and gas companies are making record profits right now. I think that the latest figures is that they're projected to make $152 billion this year. The amount that they're investing into decarbonization of those profits is very small. And as I mentioned, other sectors have started to pull their weight. And we would expect to see the oil and gas sector do the same, to reinvest those profits into lowering their emissions and to covering the damages caused by climate change. And decarbonizing industry has to be understood as a cost of doing business in today's world. We were talking about royalties earlier. It's true that royalties are up right now because prices are high and because of the royalty structure, but that also is highly cyclical. So the counter argument that we hear from the industry about the fact that they contribute to high royalties for Canadian governments is in itself a cyclical argument. And it's also a distraction from the fact that there's still a huge profit margin and that those profits should be invested in decarbonization. Those high oil prices and revenues are not also going to necessarily lead to increased employment because, as you said, companies are not necessarily investing into operations and expansion. And in many cases, they have continued to ask governments to help do that. And that's why we've seen government provide loans, including to projects like Coastal GasLink and Trans Mountain Project, because the private sector is unwilling to invest in those. So what we're seeing right now is that those profits are going to share buybacks and dividends, and the people profiting from profits right now are shareholders, and they're not necessarily Albertans, they're not necessarily Canadians, and it's not going to investment in Alberta and jobs in Alberta and in other provinces. And government is not necessarily getting as much income tax revenue. When we have high oil prices, we also see higher levels of subsidies and support. So I think that's also important to keep in mind.
And I want to provide a little context here because this is really important. Yes, the oil and gas industry is an important employer, but for example, since 2015, Alberta has lost 40,000 jobs, and analysts expect it to lose tens of thousands more jobs, and all of that is because of digitalization of the industry. So artificial intelligence and machine learning and remote sensing and all of those kinds of things have reduced the need for workers. So the old coupling between high prices go up, employment goes up is no longer true. The industry is increasing production and actually reducing employment. That's the basic trend. And the other issue here is, I would be okay talking about subsidies, maybe, if the oil companies were fully funding their environmental liabilities. So on the conventional side, where you're drilling wells, there are orphan wells and abandoned wells and lack of reclamation and remediation work, and particularly in Alberta, is a huge issue that we don't talk about, and it's tens of billions of dollars that of liabilities that aren't being funded. The oil sands tailings ponds, 37 of them. The liability conservatively estimated at $31 billion, and they've only got $900 million of security against them. So here they are making record profits. 75% of those profits are going to non-Canadian shareholders, while at the same time, they're not properly funding their own environmental liabilities and laying off Canadians and asking for government money to decarbonize. And I think when you put it together like that, getting political support across Canada, like outside of Alberta and Saskatchewan, for subsidizing decarbonization, that would be very difficult.
Yeah, and it can be helpful to look at the numbers here. So, for example, Pathways Alliance, which is an alliance of Canada's largest oil sands producers, has, they've released a plan to meet net zero. They've announced a commitment to invest $24 billion in emissions reductions between now and 2030. But if you break down those numbers in more detail, you actually realize it's a very small amount. So $24 billion is only 2% of those companies' annual profits based on revenues this year. It's a really small percentage that's going back into decarbonization. And of that 24 billion, a large portion is not actually oil and gas companies' revenues. They're actually revenues, they're taxpayer dollars, because the Canadian government has announced the carbon capture investment tax credit. And at least $7 billion of that 24 would be coming from Canadians' pockets and not actually oil and gas companies. So if you look at what we're seeing in terms of outcomes for not only tons eliminated of carbon, but also how that money is contributing to jobs, it's pretty strong argument that we can make much better investments in other sectors like renewable energy and energy efficiency that will have not only better job outcomes, that will be industries that will be more stable in the long term, but will also enable deeper and long-term emissions cuts.
I want to bring up something that hasn't been discussed before. I was going through the Pathways Alliance emissions targets. So they've committed to, by 2030, they're going to lower emissions by 22 megatons a year. And currently the oil sands emissions, well, here's the problem. 22 is supposed to be 30% of total emissions, but those are 2017 numbers, back when the oil sands was emitting about 68 megatons or 70 megatons. I just interviewed Kevin Byrne from S&P Global, who's he's certainly the foremost GHG analyst in the oil sands. And he says that as of today, emissions are 80 megatons. And then by 2050, they're going to be 90 megatons. And if CCUS isn't implemented quick enough, by 2030, it could actually be between 90 and 100 megatons. So committing to 22% by 2030 is not 30% of absolute emissions. It's a much smaller percentage. And Suncor all by itself has committed to 10 megatons by 2030. because they're going to do some efficiency regulation or renovations and so on. So the point I'm getting at here is when you dig into the numbers provided by industry, they're trying to fluff up their commitments. They're actually minuscule. And they're doing very, very, and again, in the oil sense, aside from Suncor, they're doing almost next to nothing over the next 7 or 8 years. And that, I think, all by itself, I'm not even sure that the ministers, like the federal government, understands those numbers. Anyway, a little bit of a rant, but once you get into the meat of this thing, you realize that, subsidies, their argument for subsidization falls apart, in my opinion.
I think it's really important to consider the credibility of a net zero plan. So just because a company or an association or a government has a net zero plan does not mean that that plan is good or bad, right? Like there's a lot to unpack in net zero. Do you have strong interim targets? How much are you doing absolute reductions as opposed to carbon removals? Is the time frame for that plan in line with a 1.5 degree pathway? Is it pulling its fair share compared to other industries? And one piece of really important guidance we now have is at the recent UN climate conference in Sharm el-Sheikh. We had the high-level expert group chaired by Catherine McKenna on the net zero emissions commitments of non-state entities, which basically looks at what net zero plans should look like from non-state governments. And there's a lot of really useful information in that report, drawing from best practice and the best available science about what company plans and municipal actors and other non-state actors as well should look like. And there's some very key information that's highlighted in that report that we can see is absent from a lot of oil and gas companies' net zero plans. The first is that credible company net zero plans should cover scope 3 emissions. Those are not currently covered by the Pathway Alliance plans. They should pledge agreement with a 1.5 degree pathway. There should be 5-year plans for reducing absolute emissions. And it also states something very interesting, but I think is something we're going to see increased traction on globally, which is that oil and gas companies must explicitly plan to end oil and gas exploration and development and plan in the long term to reduce production. And that is not something that we've actually been comfortable talking about in the Canadian context, but it's becoming increasingly understood in the global context that if your net zero plan is going to be credible, you have to look at that long-term pathway, which aligns not only with where we need to go environmentally, but also with projected oil demand. And that report also encourages government to regulate. So my argument would be in the Canadian context, first off, subsidies and support for decarbonization should not be provided. It's not a good use of public money. It's not in line with our international commitments. But also, if we're going to be providing money to the private sector, and that includes oil and gas companies, but also goes beyond, that we should be requiring those companies to have net zero plans in line with these robust considerations.
Yeah, this is a very complex topic, and it deserves a lot more conversation than we can devote to it today. But all that means, Vanessa, is I'll have you back for further conversations, further interviews. So thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Markham. Take care.